Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 8 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Sharks have won 2-1 in overtime. So the Sharks' losing streak comes to an end at 3 as they finally get back into the win column with their first overtime victory of the year, and consequently, of course, their first overtime game of the year. But that's not really the story of tonight's game. Instead, it's what happened a couple hours before puck drop for this one, where the Sharks announced that multiple of their roster players were actually heading into COVID protocol, and as such they had to make multiple emergency call-ups from the San Jose Barracuda, who actually had played in San Jose last night. So a lot of these players coming in to try and fill out these empty spots on the roster were going to be tired from likely having given it their all in the previous night. So this was kind of a game that was set up for failure, I guess you could say, for the San Jose Sharks, as if we take a look at the list of players who were out, there's Couture right at the top, but he wasn't actually in the COVID protocol. Instead, he was under the weather for tonight's game, so sick in some way, did not end up playing, and of course Couture's been a big part of the Sharks team thus far. But in terms of forwards, there was then Dahlen, who of course made up a second third of that top line for the Sharks, as well as Cogliano and Nieto, but the real damage was done on the back end for the Sharks, as while Burns and Ferraro were healthy and able to play in tonight's game, Carlson, Middleton, Shemek, and Vlasic, all four of those players, the bottom four defenders for the Sharks, were unable to play in this one. So a lot of new faces ended up getting injected into the lineup here tonight, many more than what the Sharks had been going for in the past few games, where it's been one substitution here or there. And so, as I said, this was a game that not many people were expecting the Sharks to honestly look all that great in, and yet they managed to squeak out the 2-1 overtime victory. And what's so interesting about this is that this wasn't a 2-1 overtime victory where the Sharks got extremely lucky or James Reimer had to carry them completely and did all the work. No, in fact, for the first 40 minutes of this game, the Sharks not only looked competitive with the Jets, but you could even make the argument that the Sharks actually looked like the better team. We're getting a lot of very good chances, and we're actually the only team to even score a goal through the first 40 minutes of this game. That was from Tomas Hertl in the first period. The second period would then go scoreless, and then we would enter the third period where the Sharks, the Cinderella carriage would end up turning back into a pumpkin. The Sharks found themselves hemmed in their own zone for the vast majority of the third period. The Jets just getting a lot of shots on net and would eventually manage to tie the game as Kyle Connor would score in the last 3 minutes of this one, and so we would head to that overtime. But in the overtime, there would be a misplay by Nikolai Ehlers along the boards. Then he would end up interfering with Brent Burns so that he wouldn't be able to get a good chance going the other way, which got the Sharks an overtime power play, which they managed to score on. Timo Meier's shot deflects off of Logan Stanley, a Winnipeg Jets defender, goes past Hellebuck and gets the Sharks the extra point in this one. Meier continues his dominance even without his normal line mates for tonight, as he gets not only the power play goal to end this game in overtime, but as well as an assist on the Tomas Hertl goal earlier in the game. But moving on into the lineup, obviously this is the most interesting thing to talk about. Here at the top, we have a first line that had to be kind of squished together, as Meier remained there at the top, obviously, and he's joined by Tomas Hertl and Barabanov. This actually ended up being a pretty decent first line for the San Jose Sharks for all things considered. I'd say especially in the first 40 minutes of this game, this line actually looked quite good. Meier and Hertl. I would also like to point out Barabanov, who looked especially good, at least for what he had done previously in the first couple of games that he played so far in this season. If there was, an opportunity for Barabanov to try and earn a consistent spot in this lineup, this was definitely the game to do that. And I felt like he actually put on a good enough performance that once the Sharks actually get back to being a full roster, fully healthy, Barabanov will likely be able to retain a spot in the lineup. Moving on to the second line, it was Eklund and Balcers kept together, but of course since Hertl, their normal center, was bumped up to the first line, it was the third line center Nick Bonino who had to be bumped up to the second line here tonight. And similar to that first line, in the first 20 to 40 minutes of this game, this line actually looked quite good. Eklund, once again, a very nice game from him, setting up some very nice plays, maybe not at the same level as it was at in the Montreal and Nashville games previously, but here tonight still very good and much better than his first 4 games of the season, which came in the the first 4 games of the season for the Sharks. Still some solid chemistry with Balcers. Actually showed off some pretty solid chemistry with Nick Bonino. Nick Bonino, I guess you could say, was a bit snake bitten in this game. Probably could have had 2, maybe even 3 grade A opportunities and potential goals just off of plays set up by Willie Merkley, but was unfortunately just not either ready or just not getting the good bounces to be able to put them back past Hellebuck early in this game. But still, solid game from the second line. In particular, Eklund stood out. On the third line, these players were kind of just pushed together. Weatherby, of course, moved up as well as with all the other centers on the Sharks. Hurdle went to the first, Bonino went to the second, so Weatherby, the fourth line center, goes to the third, joins LeBanc there, who ended up staying in that third line winger spot, and was joined by San Jose Shark, I guess you could say, full-time player from last season, John Leonard, who was unable to make the team out of training camp. And this third line, I guess the best word to describe them would be mediocre. This line really didn't do much of anything in this game. I didn't think they were bad at all, but I do think that, if you kind of removed these 3 players from the equation in this game, if you told me that they hadn't played, I wouldn't have really been all that surprised to hear that, because there wasn't necessarily much of an impact happening. I thought Leonard had maybe a couple of decent plays. Weatherby didn't look too bad, but in general, probably the Sharks' least effective offensive line of tonight's game. And moving on to the fourth line, Gadjevich and Lane Peterson are in the lineup here for tonight, obviously, but these were players who had already played games for the Sharks this season. The main new face is, of course, Nick Merkley, who ended up centering this fourth line for the Sharks. And this fourth line actually surprised me somewhat. Nick Merkley showed off a couple of nice moves, even if it wasn't necessarily a very consistent effort from him. Gadjevich continued to be a decent player, somewhat consistent on that fourth line, but the player who surprised me the most was actually Lane Peterson. Now, I will get the bad news out of the way for Lane Peterson. He was the player who made a pretty crucial mistake on this Winnipeg Jets goal that actually ended up tying the game, where he just kind of abandoned his defensive positioning. He was the player who should have been covering Kyle Connor, but instead kind of peeled off to help Ferraro, I guess, in some way, and in the end the Sharks ended up getting punished for that. So I wasn't too happy with Lane Peterson's performance on that defensive rush. However, Peterson was actually rather impressive on the offensive side. I think I saw more chances by Peterson in just this game, where he didn't even play that much ice time, about 11 minutes. I saw more chances from him in this game than I did in all of his previous other games thus far this season. So like I said with Barabanov, who likely earned himself a consistent, at least for the time being, a pretty consistent roster spot after this solid performance from him, I would suspect that Lane Peterson may have also been able to secure himself a roster spot, at least for a little while. He bought himself some leeway even when the Sharks do return to being fully healthy. On the defensive side of things, as I said, this is where it gets very interesting. When it comes to Brent Burns and Mario Ferraro leading the way as the only experienced NHL pairing here in tonight's game, it was expected that these guys would get a ton of ice time, but honestly, I was expecting Burns to actually hit above the 30-minute mark. But even in a game where he played the entirety of the overtime, because of course he played it 3-on-3 and then also started the power play with the Sharks before they scored, he actually only had just over 29 minutes in this game, which is still a ton, but in a game where 4 players were essentially playing their first game at the NHL level. Obviously not entirely true. Megna had played games previously in his career with the Anaheim Ducks, but most of these players were either they're playing their first NHL games, like Hataka and Ryan Merkley, or had played less than 50 career games previously, like Megna and Milosh. This was a very inexperienced D-corps, and the fact that Burns only got those 29 minutes, I thought was actually pretty interesting. So past Burns and Ferraro, who I thought looked okay in this game, Burns was kind of up and down for me. There were some defensive zone shifts where I thought he just looked completely off, like he had done, honestly, in the past few games, but there are also some defensive zone shifts where I thought he looked much better and much more in control and composed. So I guess that's a decent thing to see. In the end, it ended up being good enough, especially in those first 2 periods, and the Sharks did get the 2 points in this one. And while the Jets are still in the same conference as the Sharks, so it's not completely without consequence, at least they're not in the same division, so it won't be terrible to give them this one sort of loser point, I guess you could say, for them losing in the overtime. Moving on to the other four defensemen here in tonight's game. That first pairing, I guess, if you want to call them that, was of Milosh and Hataka. Hataka had been sitting on the bench for the first few games of this season as the Sharks' seventh defenseman, finally given the opportunity in this game because, of course, four Sharks defensemen were injured, I guess if you could call it injured, for tonight's game. And when it comes to Hataka, I thought he was decent-ish, nothing super impressive, had some issues defensively at times. Basically, when I talked about how Peterson and Barabanov really impressed me and could potentially keep consistent roster spots, from what I saw from Hataka, and also, spoiler alert, I guess you could say, for the other three defensemen in this game, once Middleton, Karlsson, Shemek, and Vlasic are off COVID protocol, I expect all four of them to return to the lineup because no one here tonight necessarily impressed me a ton. But I'll get to that a bit later. So first of all, Hataka, not too great. His partner, Milosh, I thought was a touch better, which I guess you could say is to be expected. Milosh, while very little NHL experience prior to this game, had still played a few, a decently sized handful of games compared to Hataka playing his first ever game as an NHL rookie. So it was expected Milosh would be a bit more calm, a bit more controlled, and that's exactly what we saw in this game. Nothing insanely impressive. Basically, the performance you would expect from Milosh as, an eighth defenseman on the San Jose Sharks. For the third pairing, we have, first of all, Megna. I thought he actually looked pretty good. Out of the four fill-in defensemen for the San Jose Sharks, Megna looked the most solid, which of course is also to be expected, the most experienced of the four fill-in defensemen. I believe he's 28 years old at this point, kind of a long-time AHL guy at this point in his career, but because of the massive holes on the Sharks roster, he actually gets to play an NHL game here with the Sharks, his first NHL game in a couple of years. I believe his last one was back in the 18-19 season with the Anaheim Ducks. But I would say he looked rather impressive. So honestly, if someone's stock shot up in this game for the defensive side of things, it would be Megna. I wouldn't be surprised if he becomes maybe that eighth defenseman for the Sharks and potentially could make a push for that seventh defenseman, but maybe they'll want him back in the AHL. I know he's kind of been a pretty steady rock for the San Jose Barracuda thus far over these past couple of years. But then obviously the big name on the defensive side of things is Ryan Merkley getting his first NHL game, and I was very excited when I heard this news. Obviously it sucked that a lot of these players were heading into COVID protocol, but the fact that Ryan Merkley, this hyped up prospect for the San Jose Sharks, was finally getting his first NHL game after a somewhat shaky preseason, but in the end I thought was mostly positive, I would say, in terms of preseason performance. I actually thought he was good enough to get even a couple extra games in that preseason, though he ended up getting sent down. And so I was expecting a solid performance from him tonight, that he would go all out to make an impact, to make an impression, try and get some eyes on him in tonight's game, but that's not really what happened. In fact, Merkley kind of looked a bit disengaged from this game for the majority of it. Not only was his defense kind of shoddy, not so great, but even on the offensive side of things, there was maybe one time where he kind of took control and maybe tried to make a move in the offensive zone, but otherwise it was a very bland and boring game from Ryan Merkley on the offensive side of things, which is really his major upside, so that's pretty disappointing to see. And on the defensive side of things, it wasn't too great, even if it also wasn't all that awful. So generally, when it comes to these bottom four defensemen, they did good enough for this game, but basically what I'll say is that those four actual Sharks defensemen, Karlsson, Middleton, Vlasic, and Shemek, can't come back soon enough. And then finally onto the goaltending, which was obviously a saving grace in here for tonight. It was James Reimer, who's honestly making a very good case for himself to become the new starter of the San Jose Sharks. Played a superb game, looked extremely steady in net, didn't have any chance really on this one goal scored by the Jets, which was by Kyle Connor. Otherwise, it was a very solid game, didn't give up too many rebounds, and you can give some credit for the Sharks defense in front of him, not giving the Jets too much of an inch. And honestly, I thought the Jets as a whole, like a team, didn't look particularly solid in tonight's game. You can't just give all the credit to the Sharks. You have to say that the Jets didn't look all that great. But even having said that, Reimer held the fort down, didn't let in a bad goal or anything like that, like we have seen from the past couple of starts of the Sharks' other starting goaltender, Aiden Hill. So I wouldn't even be surprised for James Reimer to get the next game, which of course will do it for this review, as the Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday, where they will face off the surprisingly solid Buffalo Sabres. Most people thought that this team would be awful, even though it wouldn't normally be a free win for the Sharks, because of course the Sharks aren't necessarily the best team in the NHL, and of course the Sharks have historically had some trouble with the Buffalo Sabres, though that was maybe more true a few years ago compared to recent history. But with how the Buffalo Sabres actually have looked so far this season, which is not too bad, it should still be a competitive game, and we can only hope that a lot of these COVID protocol situations where maybe some false positives and the Sharks can get a few more warm bodies into the lineup, because running with this half NHL, half AHL lineup is probably not going to get them too many wins, even if it got them one tonight. Class dismissed.